we're joined by criminologist Nirmala Gopal. Nirmal, Paul O'Sullivan's going to be quite explosive, but I don't imagine that he would be particularly cooperative. What are some of the issues that you think should be top of mind for those members of the committee when he appears?
Well, good afternoon, Oliver, and good afternoon to your viewers. In my opinion, I think the main conversation with Paul O'Sullivan is going to be around his interference and his appearance and his visibility within the legal framework. I mean, the legal institutions. For example, he's been accused of interfering with investigations in as far as IPID was concerned. So I think the relationship between Robert McBride and Paul O'Sullivan is going to be interrogated quite fiercely, since we heard in the last week the kind of conversations that McBride had faced. And I think a great deal or a significant number of those questions revolved around Paul O'Sullivan. Because remember, he is a person of great interest at the moment, especially for the parliamentary committee.
Robert McBride's testimony was fascinating, to say the least. What stood out most for you there?
Yeah, I think it was. I also regarded it as quite fascinating. And I think what stood out for me the most is the kind of corruption that he had identified during his time as the IPID chief, but also during his time when he was the head of the Ekurhuleni Metro Police. And I think for me, in addition to the fact that that stood out, is the fact that nothing has really been done since his identification of these matters. Of course, we know that they will have to be tested in a court of law, but let's base our assumption at this point in time on the premise that the information or the testimony that he has provided is actually reliable. And if it is reliable, then it is really disheartening to hear that nothing has been done or very little has been done in terms of holding the perpetrators accountable.
Yeah. Fascinatingly, McBride's relationship with Paul O'Sullivan was also quite the spotlight, and you raised that it should be put to McBride, or at least to Paul O'Sullivan, the nature of the relationship he had with McBride, and I guess many others will come up in that. But it raises questions around whether or not Paul O'Sullivan yielded undue influence over institutions like IPID during McBride's time. Is that of concern to you?
I think it is of huge concern, especially within the larger debate of, in terms of how the Ad Hoc Committee is actually questioning or had questioned McBride. So I think certainly he has come up quite frequently as a person of interest, and I would assume that he came up in the Matlala Commission as well. So definitely I think, there's going to be a great deal of interrogation, and I think of course, hoping that parliamentary, the MPs are going to have a golden thread that runs across or runs through their own questioning, that they will be able to poke holes in Paul O'Sullivan's testimony, or be able to connect the dots between his testimony and what McBride has provided at this point in time to actually triangulate that kind of data to see whether McBride has actually been credible as a witness as well.
Yeah. And Vuzimuzi Ket Matlala once again was raised, and very specifically so during the testimony by Julius Mkhwanazi of Ekurhuleni Metro Police Department. We've seen Mkhwanazi appear before the Matlala Commission, and there was a clear distinction between his temperament then and his temperament before the committee. But what stood out for you in Mkhwanazi's testimony this past week?
So I think his very fierce protection of Ket Matlala. It came out so often. He went all out to make sure that he protected Ket Matlala.
Yeah, and that relationship, particularly around whether or not blue lights were installed and the nature of his relationship with Ket Matlala came up, especially when he seems to have tried to make the argument previously that he had no relationship with Ket Matlala, and then MP said, you said it, and it's inconsistent with the evidence that you're now giving us here, where quite clearly there was a strong relationship between, or at least a worrying relationship between yourself and Ket Matlala. Do you get the sense, at least from Mkhwanazi's appearance before the Ad Hoc Committee, in combination with his appearance before the Matlanga Commission, that Ket Matlala had fully and successfully infiltrated the Ekurhuleni Metro Police Department?
Undoubtedly so, Oliver. He has, I'm not sure whether it's an ongoing matter, but he has definitely infiltrated Mkhwanazi's space.
And given the terms
Mkhwanazi had actually facilitated that.
Yeah, and given the terms of reference, do you think MPs have an idea and an answer as to legislatively, structurally, policy-wise, what needs to be done to prevent and undo such instances?
I think they most definitely have, because they have their own legal teams, etc., probably sitting outside of Parliament. And I think, remember, it's election. I think there's local elections going on right now, but also the national elections, which will come up in a couple of years. So each one is going to use this as an electioneering campaign as well, because we all understand that crime and corruption is one of the big ticket items in South Africa. And South Africans in general are looking to those parties who can genuinely and authentically come up with ideas that will resolve or reduce the rates of crime and corruption. So certainly they would use their legal teams, and they will come up with workable and within the legislative framework with solutions that will help take this country forward.
Yeah. It was during McBride's testimony that the issue of security assessments and vetting came up. And McBride explained what the difference is between a periodic assessment to determine whether or not an officer or an official has sold out to the country versus whether or not they have been compromised and are participating in, let's call it run-of-the-mill corruption within the South African Police Service. Are we doing enough of those to safeguard the integrity of the officers that make up these organizations?
So I think as far as what you term general corruption, I think we're not doing enough, and that's why we have the Matlanga Commission and the Ad Hoc Committee that have been constituted. So certainly I think that would be a resounding no. But in terms of, and I think what we call it sedition and rendition, and that is where externally and internally the state as an institution is actually threatened by both internal and external actors. It's possible that we're not doing enough. Although listening to McBride, it seems as though they have lots of interventions in as far as that is concerned. But I would like to believe that even if we have one threat to the state, that would be one threat too many. So it's absolutely critical and essential that any threat to the state is dealt with immediately and with major consequences for the actor that actually threatens the state.
Yeah. And just lastly, Nirmala, what are some of the questions that still remains top of mind and unanswered for you regarding what has been uncovered by both the Matlanga Commission and the Ad Hoc Committee that you believe very specifically the Ad Hoc Committee needs to perhaps begin to set its sights on?
So I think what's been very interesting and really interesting, I think the more frequently we call in new witnesses, we are hearing different kinds of testimony. For example, including McBride, who really had, as far as the public was concerned, didn't have much to do in as far as crime and corruption was concerned. But the kind of testimony that he provided, I think, opened up an entire new can of worms. And part of what he spoke about is the KZN generals, that general and Mkhwanazi's role in crime and corruption. So I think that's still outstanding, and we're going to have to test that both with the general himself, but also look for the kind of revisit the documentation that McBride has actually mentioned and see whether there is any veracity to the claims that he has made. Because like you mentioned at the outset, McBride provided some damning evidence or testimony, and I think that absolutely has to be tested. But also, I think what the South African society is looking for is who forms the remaining four of the big five. And I think those questions have not yet been answered. Perhaps it's coming out in very obtuse ways, and the Matlala Commission might be able to understand and unpack who the other four are. But I think that's identifying very clearly for the South African community who the remaining four are is going to be a critical question. And of course, that will come through in the nature of the questions and answers of the remaining witnesses.
Yeah. Nirmala, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. Nirmala Gopal is a criminologist talking to us there about the upcoming testimony and work of the Parliamentary Ad Hoc Committee.